I was born and raised in Pabianice, Poland, a town of about 65,000 with 12,000 Jews in it. I was the youngest of 4 children. I was brought up in an observing, conservative Jewish home. I attended public school. I was very active in many different sports, primarily soccer. I had a very loving and a very caring family. My father was quite well-to-do. He owned a huge textile mill. And all this, I can say that I had a very happy childhood. And all this came to an end on September the 1st, 1939, when Second World War broke out. I was 11 years old. After about 10 days, the German army occupied our city. The first thing they did is they burned down our big, beautiful Jewish synagogue with all the holy books and the Torahs and everything in it. And then they used it as a stable for the horses. The radios and the telephones were confiscated, and then we were ordered to give up all our books and our possessions. In fact, we threw them out to the window, and they were burning them in the streets. A short while later, the Jewish ghetto was formed. We were forced to live in a few square blocks in the old city. And of course, to put it in proper perspective, 99% of Europeans live in apartments. So if somebody owns a decent one-family home, it's considered a palace. So we had to share our apartments with all the Jewish people who lived outside of those few square blocks in the old city. For instance, being that my father was quite well-to-do, we had a nice modern apartment, and running water and a toilet and a bathtub, which were only a few in the entire city. So we took in 2 families and a lady dentist. After the ghetto was formed, we were all forced to work for producing many very valuable items for the German Nazi machine. Food was very scarce, and things were really tough. If you didn't work, you didn't get any rations. But what kept us going is the fact that we were still with our families. And this too came to an end on May the 15th of 1942, when the orders came to evacuate the Pabianice ghetto. At which point we all marched to this huge complex, soccer complex, and out of nowhere, there were several hundred of SS stormtroopers. And of course, they took over and the selections were made. The elderly and the sick were taken away. And then they went after the infants. And of course, the children, they all stand there all around that complex in different groups. And then they went after the infants. And we stood there in absolute horror when one of the SS stormtroopers grabbed the baby out of the arms of his mom and threw him against the concrete wall, and the tiny body split into many different pieces. This was the sadistic and brutal way of the SS stormtroopers. In spite of it, the mothers refused to part with their children, and so they were beaten to a point that no longer could exist. This was a night that I shall never forget. The praying and the pleading and the crying was going on for hours. There was a pile of little babies laying 7 or 8 high, crying their little hearts out, and nobody cared. After many hours, they were all taken away, never to be seen again, and the able bodies were sent into the Lodz ghetto. Geographically, Lodz was only a few kilometers away from our city. But Lodz was the 2nd largest city in Poland, with a population of 750,000 and almost 250,000 Jews. When we came into the Lodz ghetto, there were only 90,000 left. Now Lodz was altogether different than Pabianice. Every single day there were between 300 or 400 people dying from hunger and from disease. The large ghetto was surrounded by barbed wire, and every 50 or 60 yards there was a stormtrooper watching us day and night. Hunger, real hunger, is almost impossible to describe, and I don't wish it on anybody. There was not unusual in the large ghetto if a dear one in the family or a neighbor, if somebody passed away, they kept the body for 5 or 6 days until the new rations came out so they can benefit from the extra food. It was not unusual to hear, especially men, they just couldn't take it anymore. So when the rations came out, they ate them up in the first 2 or 3 days, and they were found laying on the streets. They could no longer keep up with digging individual graves, so they were buried in unmarked mass graves. One has to wonder why the Nazis gave us so little food, because Lodz was better known also as Litzmannstadt, because the German Reich, believing that there were less than 1,000 years, Germanized a lot of the Polish city. Like Lodz was named after a Nazi general, Litzmannstadt. Wrocław was called Breslau, Lvov, Lemberg, and so on. In the Lodz ghetto, there were many different factories. There were 3 huge metal factories producing all kinds of parts. We didn't know what they were for, but whenever they gave it a specification, we made it. There were 2 shifts, day and night. There were many factories producing civilian clothing, uniforms. We produced furniture, nails, needles, leather goods. Everybody, of course, had to work. If you didn't work, you didn't get any ration. And 2 more very important items that I want to mention were that we produced in the Lodz ghetto. There were 2 factories, maybe 700 or 800 young teenage girls working there, and they were making shoes from straw, and they were sent to the Ostfront. At that time, Germany was already at war with Russia, and the German soldiers wore them on their boots to protect their feet from not getting frozen. And there were also 2 huge factories working day and night, Germany had confiscated from 3/4 of Europe all the furs that were brought into Lodz ghetto. We would cut them up and we would make ski masks and earmuffs, which were also sent to the East Front. Again, what kept us going, what kept us alive, was the fact that we're still with the families and our faith. And this too came to an end at the beginning of the summer of 1945, when the orders came to liquidate the ghetto. By the way, the Lodz ghetto was the first one established and the last one liquidated. At that point, we were taken and put into the cattle cars, anywhere between 90 and 100 people in every cattle car. All we got altogether is a pail of water and another pail to use for sanitary things. I would not even attempt to describe the conditions in those cattle cars. After 5 or 6 days, we arrived in Auschwitz. After we disembarked, the men were told to the right, the women went to the left. I saw my mom and my 2 sisters. They waved to me, I waved back, and I never saw them again. My father, my brother, myself continued marching towards Dr. Mengele, better known as the Angel of Death, who was in charge of the selections. My father went first, then my brother. When it came my turn, He was hesitating. Because I was really a skinny little kid. But what saved me is the fact that my father, who worked in a clothing distribution center in the Lodz ghetto, and he brought me this plaid coat with huge pads, shoulder pads, and it made me look like a man, but I was nothing but a skinny kid. And after hesitation, he finally let me go through. We kept on marching into this huge hall where we were told to totally undress. Our heads were shaven. We were disinfected, and then we went in to take the showers. After we took the showers, we were given a pair of striped pants and a shirt and a hat. I walked outside. I was looking for my father. I couldn't find him. My father was standing right next to me. I didn't recognize my own father. He was only like 43 years old at the time. This man aged 30 years in these couple of hours because he realized where we found ourselves. Auschwitz. How can one possibly describe Auschwitz? Auschwitz was miles of concentration camp surrounded by high voltage electric wire, and every 50 or 60 feet there was a tower with an assessment mounting a machine gun. Auschwitz. I got. Auschwitz was a place where there were thousands of people brought in every single day from every corner of Europe, from as far as Greece, Romania, Hungary, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Poland, and so on. And the selections were made. The elderly and the sick were taken away, and the children, of course, put into the gas chambers and the crematoriums, and the able bodies were sent to the many camps, and eventually from there they were sent to the many hundred of concentration camps in Germany and in Austria. Auschwitz. Auschwitz had 4 huge crematoriums operating 24/7. And the smell and the stench of burning human flesh is so distinct that it cannot be confused with anything else. And many a days when I watched the smoke belching out of the chimneys, I wonder, whose turn is it next? Is it my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my neighbors? Auschwitz. In addition of being in charge of these selections, the infamous Dr. Mengele was also in charge of the most heinous, sadistic, and brutal experiments performed in modern history, starting with radical and partial castration on the finest specimen of man. I bunked with 2 of them, Abraham Sachs and Lanek Urbach, and I saw them. It's unbelievable. You should have seen the build on those men and the women. When I rode by the experiment block, I saw the women, their heads shaven, their faces grimaced with excruciating pain, walking on all fours, not even the slightest resemblance to a human being. And the children. The favorite of Dr. Mengele was to break rifle butts on the heads of the children to see how many it would take until their brain would be completely shattered. Auschwitz. My brother was taken away to a concentration camp in northern Germany, and it was on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. It's the holiest day for the Jewish people. And the German Nazis were very well aware of it because there were always executions, hangings, shootings, some kind of punishment. It was on the eve of Yom Kippur when the SS stormtroopers entered our camp. By the way, our camp was called Zigeunerlager. That means gypsy camp. There were 35,000 Romans in that camp. And in order to make room for the men from the Lodz ghetto, 2 weeks prior to that, they were all put to their death. but the name still remained as a kind of lager. When they came in, they demanded 700 teenagers. My sister's boyfriend, who had some privileges in this block, realized what was going on. And he grabbed me, he threw me under his bunk, and he covered me with a blanket. I said he had some privileges because we didn't have bunks. We slept on the bare concrete. Whenever you sit down, that's how we slept. And I listened when they were rounding up those 700 teenagers marching towards the gas chambers, praying and crying and pleading. My father was not aware what was going on with me. And when he saw me the next morning when this was over, he came over to me and he said, "Morris, we must get out of here. This is pure hell." So as I was telling you, there were daily transports going to the hundreds of concentration camps all over Germany. We very quickly registered, and we jumped on a truck, we were taken to a railway station, put in the cattle cars, and we were on our way to Germany. Little did we know what was waiting for us. After 4 or 5 days, we arrived at a camp called Kaufering, which was a satellite of Dachau. After a couple of weeks, we were transferred to another concentration camp called Kaufbeuren. Now, Kaufbeuren was considered by the German Nazis as a Vernichtungslager, that means a camp of destruction. The original transport into Kaufering from Auschwitz were 1,200 men. Our group was 350. When we came into Kaufbeuren, there were only 500 left. 700 were already killed. It's almost impossible to describe the conditions in Kaufbeuren, but very briefly I will try. In the morning, I mean, we don't know what time it was. We were walking up and we left the camp, it was dark, and when we came back it was dark. We were given like a cup what they called coffee, what was like made out of burned corn, and it was nothing near coffee. And then we marched for about 5 or 6 miles to this huge complex. My wife, my father and I were assigned to dig foundations with pick and shovel. When I think back, I can't believe my father and myself doing that kind of work, but that's what we assigned, that's what we did. Now, the SS stormtroopers didn't need an excuse to beat somebody up, but if somebody got a beating, the most they can last a day or two. Of course, at lunchtime, yeah, I must tell you, we got a soup which made from skin of potatoes, but it was hot and was delicious. After we came home back into the barracks at night, we were given a slice of bread, which most of the time was already spoiled, and a little thing of margarine. My father got sick in 2 weeks to go to commando, so he stood behind in the block. Whenever I would come home or come back into the boat, he would talk to me. He would tell me he used to get beaten up every single day, but there were no marks on his face or on his body. You see, the SS troopers, they know exactly how to beat you up and hurt you without leaving any scars. And I asked him why. He said to me the reason that he used to get a beating every day is because they wanted him to go to the sick block, which was adjoining our block. And he knew the most he can last there is 24 hours. I wouldn't even attempt to describe the conditions there. So he was hoping he would feel better, he'd get the strength back and be able to go and work on it. One morning, they came into our block. They dragged my father from the bunk. I followed him. They took him into a small shack, and I stood there totally in disbelief when they were pulling the teeth from his mouth. His body was still warm. You see, in those days, when a man needed a crown, they made it out of gold. So they killed him for that. And to pay my final respect to my father, I volunteered for the burial commando, which nobody really wanted to do because these were all friends that we buried. The burial commando consisted of a blanket with 4 men, everybody holding on to one end. We put 6 or 7 bodies in, and we walked for about 3 or 4 miles outside the camp into this huge pit. 2 of them let go, and the body just dropped them into the pit. We repeated it 7 or 8 different times until everybody was buried, and I came back into my block. When the Oberkörper saw me there, he says, "What are you doing here? How come you didn't go to your regular commando?" I told him, we just finished, I volunteered to the burial commando. And he says, "I shouldn't have done that because we're short-handed, and for this, I'm going to get 50 lashes on my behind." So the way that everybody came back from one commando, everybody was ordered to gather around. Even the German commander came in to watch. They put me over the table, they pulled down my pants, and at this time, the German commander says, "No 25, only 25 lashes because I'm a teenager." But the truth is that after the first few, you really don't, you're numb. But I still have the scars to prove it. After they were done, some of my friends pulled me over into my bunk, and as I was laying there in pain, I must confess to you, I sort of gave up. I lost my will to go on. This was without a doubt the lowest point of my very young life. But my friends, somehow they got a hold of some rags and they soaked them into the snow, and they were taking turn. They were laying compresses all night long because they knew when it comes morning, I will have to go to work, and I did. I don't know how, but I did. Maybe about 2 weeks after that, the orders came to liquidate the camp. Out of 1,550 men, we were 118, and we were taken to the infamous camp of Dachau. When we came into Dachau, we were welcomed. We were greeted by the welcoming committee, which consisted of 4 gallows with men hanging there. And then we marched through the infamous gate. We said, "Arbeit macht frei," which means work will set you free. And we continued marching towards the showers, which were adjoining the crematorium and the gas chambers. We were told to get our totally undressed. They told us they're going to disinfect our clothing. We went in, we were waiting for the shower, for the water to come out. And by that time, we already heard about the infamous cyclone gas that the Germans used. A can for about 39 cents killed more than 1,000 people. So we really didn't know if the water would come out or not. But the water did come out. We took the showers, we were giving back our clothing. We were taken into the blocks, and about 10 days later, we were sent to another concentration camp called Mildorf. In Mildorf, I worked at a quarry, and I got sick. I came down with dysentery. This is a terrible disease. I mean, you don't want to eat. All you want to really do is die. It's just a terrible, terrible disease. I was taken into the sick camp, adjoining to the labor camp, and maybe after 2 or 3 days, I was okay. Realizing that nothing good can happen to me if I stay in this camp, I went back to the officer in charge, and I said, "I'd like to go back to the lab." "I'm okay, I'd like to go to work and everything." He says, "You can't let me do that because they found typhoid and the camp was under quarantine." About 10 days later or so, we were told that they're going to send us to a huge central typhoid camp. Again, they threw us into the cattle cars. After they sealed the door, I looked around. These people were half dead. I really thought that this was the final hour for me. So I said the Shema, which is in the Jewish faith, like the final prayer, and I fell asleep from exhaustion. When the thing came to a home, I looked through the cracks of the cattle car and I saw a camp. And I said, my good God, I mean, why would I save those people when they were killing hundreds of thousands of healthy men and women? I don't have an answer for that. But we were taken into this huge typhoid camp. And by that time, it was already beginning of spring of 1945. That's when the orders came for the infamous death marches. You see, Adolf Eichmann had a plan, and he called it the final solution of the Jewish question. And his plan was, every concentration camps in Germany were ordered to march south of Germany to the Austrian border. Right outside of Mittenwald, there was a huge forest called Tyrol, T-Y-R-O-L. And that's where we would be given poison soup, and after the American army would come in, there'd be nothing left but a little mountain of ashes. Now, thank God this plan didn't quite work out. As you know, Germany was divided in 4 parts. The eastern part was occupied by Russia, the western by France, the northern by England, and the southern part by the United States of America. And so that was the furthest, because they started north, so they felt they have time to do that. Being that the men in the typhoid camp could hardly stand up. So they couldn't walk, of course. They were all taken right in back of the camp was a track, a railroad track, and this huge train came, huge. I mean, there must have been 25 or 30,000 men on it. And they ran out of cattle cars, so we were put on an open coal car. And we were on our way south to Germany. After a few days, the train came to a stop. It was the village called Schwabhausen, which I will never forget. And the reason the train came to a stop, because on the next track, there was a huge anti-aircraft train. The Germans called it a Flakjob, with huge guns, the likes of which I never saw before. So they were shielding themselves, hoping that the Americans are not going to bother them or disable them, because there'd be a lot of casualties. But the Americans were very determined, and rightfully so, because after all, they were shooting at them. And as hard as they tried not to harm any of us, they disabled that huge train, which was pushed and pulled by 8 huge locomotives. The reason was a lot of casualties, because as a machine gun bullet, as you guys know, went right through 5 or 6 who were laying like sardines, one on top of the other. I would not even attempt to describe the scene. There were hundreds of men laying there without arms or legs, just bleeding to death. The Germans had nothing to give us. They had nothing. And so, in the afternoon, they allowed us to go to the village to get some water. And I will never forget that the skies turned black and the heavy rains came down. And so the SS troopers took shelter at the farmers' houses, and there was nobody there. We just kept walking. There were 5 of us. And walking until we came to a German farmhouse. The farmer took us in, he gave us clothing, he gave us food, and he hid us up in the hayloft. In the morning, he woke us up, and he said, it seems like the war is over. because Munich surrendered. They hung out the white flags. But the war wasn't over, because Berlin gave orders that Munich has to fight out into the very last person, because that was the cradle, the birth of the Hitler-Jugend movement, of the Hitler movement. But he told us that one of our friends, called Leibke, was burning up with the temperature. And if we don't give him some help, he's not going to last too long. And he told us that there's a cloister less than a mile away called Santo Tilian. And these people would help us. So we made our way in the forest, exactly following the road, and we came in late at night in the back of this huge, huge building. Being that I was the youngest, I volunteered to knock on the door. I knocked on the door opened up, there was a nun. I didn't have to say anything. She said, "Come in, my child." I told her there were 4 more of my buddies hiding in the forest. She told me to come and get him. We took all our clothes off, which they burned immediately. I can tell you, there were thousands of lice just on the collar alone. And they gave us food, and I took a bath with hot water and soap. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to get out of the town. And they gave us new clothes, and then the Bernard brothers came, and they took us away and they hid us. On April the 28th of 1945, they woke us in the morning. They said, "Children, the American army is very, very close. There might be some shooting, so we will be safer in the basement." We went down to the basement. I got a hold of an apple cart, and I looked out to the little window, and I saw the first American tank coming up the hill. How can I possibly describe to you the jubilation in my heart of being free? How can I possibly describe to you the feeling of knowing that this nightmare was over? And now, 68 years later, and 4 generations strong, I stand before you, a very grateful and proud man, grateful for the opportunity that this greatest country in the world gave me to start a new life, to raise a family, and to live in freedom and in liberty. I must thank the members of the American Armed Forces for their sacrifices and for the patriotism, and finally so heroically to free Europe and to make it possible for me to be here today. First, I want to salute you for defending freedom in the world. You are my heroes. All the survivors owe you their life, and Europe owes you their freedom. So in conclusion, I'd like to say, you are the future of this greatest country in the world, and it's in your hands, and it's in your power to make sure that something like that should never happen again, not only to the Jewish people, to any other people on earth.